Well, hello there and welcome to Digging Deeper. We've got another episode for you and I am joined with Pete and Robert.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, guys.
Wow, you're so excited.
Welcome to Digging Deeper.
You guys are so excited. I love
so
this.
excited.
Wow,
This is awkward as
It's
possible.
the
This is
Bible.
great. Yeah.
The Bible.
Hey, so
That's a book for me.
yesterday Pete actually gave a pretty awesome message.
was
I
great,
thought it
man.
was great.
It was.
And it was about how can we
thanks,
trust the Bible. Now, before we get into any of these questions, which we have a good amount brought in from the text to ask question number. But before we get there, before the message, we were talking and you were like, I am not excited to give this message. But then it was like an incredible message. Like what was kind of going through your mind there?
That's a good question.
And did you feel like the tide kind of turning as you were preaching it and feeling like people receiving it?
I think anyone that does this any amount of time will attest to this. You just never know. Like there are times that, and we've talked about this, there are times that I have prepared messages that in my head, I was like, this is going to bring the glory of the Lord. Revival is about to spread across the country.
This is
and
it.
people just stare at me and they're like, are you done yet? And then I'll have weeks where I'm like, this is just garbage. Why am I even doing this? And everyone's like, that was amazing. I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Yesterday felt, leading up to it, just so much information that I think in my head, I was very scared that people would just kind of, their eyes would glaze over after like 10 or 15 minutes. So that was my biggest fear going into it. Yeah, I don't know. I guess.
Do you feel like there was a good reception? Do you feel like as you were preaching it, you felt like a connection or that it was connecting with people?
I think moment of honesty. I think I had to come to a place of not caring. And that happened sometime early Sunday morning, I think, which we all have to do that really.
Right.
It's an important part of preaching. When you get on stage and you're overly thinking about, you always need to be aware of your audience and thinking about how it's landing, but you can psych yourself out in this way of like being so worried about it. At some point you just have to be like, just do this. I also have a little bit of almost I don't know what you might call it, like sore spot or insecurity sometimes about being pegged or labeled
As
as
the
like
Bible answer man.
the intellectual guy who
Yes.
always
The
does a
professor,
class. And I was actually behind the stage praying while the band was playing their last song, and I found myself kind of like that was my prayer. Like, God, I don't want to be this guy all the time. Like this. I was looking at my notes. I'm like, these notes are just. I feel like I'm in a seminary class right now, and I didn't plan on saying any of this, but I felt like the Holy Spirit just kind of whispered to me, like, "You are who I created you to be.
That's right. It's
Go
good.
do it."
Yeah.
And it was almost like when he said that, there was just a freedom of like, stop worrying about it. I am who I am. We have multiple different kinds of people who get on stage, and this is who God made me to be. So I think I walked out with a bit more of like this is who I am. Let's do this.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think that you're equipped for it. And what I loved about your message was that there's time when you're giving a lot of information, not just you, but the person preaching is giving a lot of information to make a point. And there's moments where the information is the point. And I felt like yesterday was a message where the information was the answer to the difficult question that was a tripping hazard that was being discussed. And so it really not only, yes, it helped that you're so equipped on this topic, but God actually, I think, also used your equipping, your intellectual ability and your ability to retain information and facts to equip the body and equip the saints for the work of the ministry. So I thought I was stoked about it. I thought God really used you.
well, thank you. And I'm sure that the first 5 minutes of this podcast, people have enjoyed hearing everyone say how great I am.
Pete, you're so great.
Fantastic.
But I do
No,
think
it
it's
was good.
interesting,
I'm
like,
so uncomfortable about
I don't
this.
know
Moving on.
past generations, right? I can't speak on behalf of them, but I do know that like currently where we stand in our cultural context, a lot of people hear little bites of information either on TikTok or on Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts, or they listen to a 10-minute YouTube video about how the Bible's not reliable. And so before they even heard someone preach about the reliability of the Bible or the certainty that we can have about the Bible, they hear someone else saying you can't. And a lot of times when the first thing that you hear about a thing is the thing that you naturally end up kind of believing until you
sticks with you.
Yeah. So it sticks with you until you purposefully deconstruct it or until you purposely look at, why do I believe this? Why do I think that?
Yeah.
So to have these subjects are super important for someone who's not going to seminary or someone who's not doing that, because they're going to be hearing a 1.5 minute TikTok about why the Bible's not reliable. And then that's just going to be constantly in the back of their mind.
And so I think some questions.
Yeah. And so I think that that's super cool and important, and we'll use that to segue into these questions that people do have. And I wanted to start the first one off. 2 questions are very similar, so I'm going to read them back to back, and then you can answer them however you want. I took a class at SDSU taught by a rabbi. He believed that many Old Testament stories are fables to teach a moral lesson, creation, flood, etc. What do you think of that? So there's the first question. Another question from someone else. Should we interpret all the stories in the Bible literally? Some of the stories have amazing metaphor for how the world around us works. And I fear that some of that can be lost to people when they look at the Bible only as a history lesson without deeper meaning.
Those are big questions.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, they are.
They're definitely, I would say they're definitely connected, adjacent to the topic of the Bible's trustworthiness, because when, and I kind of made a joke with you guys last week, as I was prepping for this message, I usually land in the 6 to 7 page area, and I was on page 13.
Oh my gosh.
And I had gone in a whole direction of other reasons, what are all the reasons you can't trust the Bible, and let's talk through all of them. And then I knew I was just gonna have to cut it all down.
Yeah.
And a big part of it that got cut out was one reason of many that people struggle with trusting the Bible is not knowing how to properly read it can lead to just wow, this is stupid. Well, actually, so someone's like, well, I can't trust the Bible because I don't really believe that a 10-headed dragon is going to come out of the ocean and with the whore of Babylon on its back or something. Yeah. It's well, actually, that's not how you should be reading that book of Revelation. So I would obviously, and it's a whole thing in itself. The second half of that question about should we interpret all stories in the Bible literally, I just want to be so precise, which I know is that sentence kind of concerns me because stories in the Bible generally do come to us with a heart or intent to tell something true about history. Parables don't, and certain kinds of other writings don't. Yeah. So if the question was, should we interpret everything in the Bible literally? My answer is absolutely not. Of course not. I mean, God doesn't have literal chicken wings. He's not a hen that there are obviously metaphors and things. Stories in the Bible though, that aren't obviously parables tend to have more of a, this happened kind of thought behind them. So if you're really getting into the story aspect of it, which the first question did, flood, creation, things like that is a little more difficult thing to navigate.
There's also the element of people, Genesis as a story has a way different connotation and even belief system around it than 1 Samuel as a story. You know what I mean? A lot of people, they're way more quick to say Genesis is figurative, versus 1 Samuel being in the days of this person at this time with this person did this. So even within Old Testament, because there's another one about the message seemed to focus more on the Old Testament or the New Testament versus the Old Testament. But even within the Old Testament, there are parts where it's well, how literal is this? And then how literal is this? You know?
And I would think if I could really just get into the weeds with it, because I think people want the weeds in these questions. I can't think of any stories in the New Testament that are not meant to be taken literally, that aren't actual parables.
Or like apocalyptic.
Yes.
Like,
But I don't think apocalyptic is written as a story.
Right. Okay.
So, and that's the thing. Like when you say a story, like the main stories we have in the New Testament are the four Gospels,
Right.
And the story elements of the four Gospels are meant to be taken as historical. And we can get into another question about that as well. The rest of the New Testament are mostly letters, teachings, explanations, expositions, and even Revelation is not a story per se. When you look at the Old Testament tends to, it's almost like the different books have kind of coalesced into different sections. We often refer to them as the law and the prophets, but I think it even breaks down more than that. You have the first part of the Old Testament leading all the way up to probably Nehemiah does come to us in a story or narrative form. And then everything beyond that looks more like prophets and things, but even the prophets have stories in them. So Jeremiah has prophecies, but then there's also little bits of, and then this happened and this happened. So I think the first thing I would say is I would be very cautious of blanket statements like no or yes. It's like, well, which book are we talking about? Which section of the book are we talking about?
Right.
And I would even say, and I've said this before, like I would apply the same standard to Genesis. If someone says, do you take Genesis literally? My first response would be like, I don't like which part, right? Like, it's a huge book probably put together by, I think it was probably written by more than one author and probably put together by more than one person. So there are parts of Genesis that I think the style of writing lends itself more to poetry or analogy or metaphor. And then there are parts of it that I think whoever wrote it clearly wants the reader to believe this is history they're teaching me. I mean, especially for the Jewish people, the entire story of Abraham and his calling and his descendants were a huge part of their national identity. And so they absolutely believed everything from chapter 12 on was real historical truth about their own national history. So I think I would just say like, yes, there's definitely literal things and non-literal metaphorical things in the Bible, but I don't think it's as simple as just blanket statements. I think you have to look at each individual ones by themselves. I
love John Walton's quote. You may have heard it, that the entire Bible is written for us all, but was not necessarily written to us all. And so considering even original audiences and context and things like that kind of helps us in interpreting and learning how to study the Bible and making sure that we understand that we're not taking, it's dangerous to take a story that is meant to be literal and history and then use it figuratively and then misapply it to our lives to come up with any type of solution we want. And then the opposite is true as well, to take a figure of speech in the Bible or something like that and then turn it into a literal prescription for your life and that as well. And so, I mean, I would
So I shouldn't pluck out my eye.
No, I think that's literal. You should do that.
Okay.
So
all right.
No.
There's also things, even literal things aren't necessarily meant to be applied.
There's descriptive versus
there are things in the Bible
yes.
that just say they happened, but they don't. Like I've heard that said before. Like, well, if it's in the Bible, why are bad things in the Bible? It's like because the Bible tells a story of bad people. Because humans are bad.
Yes.
There's all kinds of brokenness and sin throughout the Bible. Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean God wants you to do it. So, yeah, I would say like it's a hard question, but the quick answer is yes. We should always be looking for metaphors and not jumping to the conclusion that everything is literal. But I also think like it's a good opportunity for grace and like some open-handedness, especially with other Christians and other believers here at Rise City.
Yeah,
man, I would say if you took 5 random people and put them in a room, and you might have 3 or 4 different opinions about some passages, whether they're literal, not literal, how to read them,
especially creation flood type situations.
And that's okay. I think if you get into the areas of like, well, the whole story of Jesus was just a metaphor. Like, well, now you've lost me, right? We're not talking about ancient writings that have been, we're talking like, hold on, like, no, the Gospels come to us as history. So I would draw the line there for sure.
Right.
It's a good line.
Speaking of the Gospels, this one just kind of seems like a little personal to someone. Why aren't the Gospels written as first person?
I read that question. What was your guys' thought about maybe I'm trying to figure out what they meant by that, like written in the I.
Like, and then I saw Jesus go and heal.
I think they're
5
asking the
people,
question about
and then
eyewitness accounts.
Yeah, but even even when what the Gospel of John, when it talks about how one disciple outran Peter,
The disciple who Jesus loved.
yeah, and it's like, why wouldn't you just say you? Like why is there this element of like why didn't you just say I? Why is it the disciple Jesus loved, or John, or this is the account of Jesus, and there's no like real first person narrative involved in those?
So okay, that is actually a really good question. now that I make sense of it.
Gotcha.
The first time you see first person show up is in the book of Acts, actually. So in Acts, you start to see the journey becomes we did this. So the author
That's when
that we
Luke
believe
started.
is Luke.
Yeah.
So if Luke was comfortable using first person language in Acts, why wasn't he in the Gospel of Luke? And I would give 2 answers to that apply to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is number 1, Luke wasn't there. Mm-hmm. So Luke doesn't pretend to have been there. There's no and that in yesterday's my message, I talked about how the most important criteria for a biblical book was authorship. And the issue it was apostleship, but it wasn't just apostleship. It was apostleship or someone who knew and was commissioned and walked with. So because we see in Luke that he clearly traveled with Paul, knew Paul, he used the we language in Acts when they were traveling together. The church believed that Luke was an authoritative, trustworthy writer of the Gospels. But Luke wasn't there, and neither was Mark. So they wouldn't have used first person. Mm-hmm. Matthew is a little bit trickier. So the question of whether or not Matthew was the Gospel according to Matthew, was it written by someone named Matthew who was a tax collector? We don't actually know that's true. It doesn't say it was written by Matthew. We see that show up with an early church father named Papias in 110, somewhere around there. So you're talking about probably 40 years after it was written, somebody gave it the name Matthew. There's reasons why that could be. It looks like it was written from a Jewish perspective. But there's also reasons why it might not make sense for it to have been Matthew, the tax collector. So even just saying, it's very possible that the gospel we call Matthew, was not written by the apostle Matthew, but by someone that knew him or walked him or something like that. The other thing though is, what are these books? And so this is a big question that people have talked about and wrestled with and argued about for a long time. Mm-hmm. The short answer is there's nothing directly to compare the Gospels to in the ancient world to say like, this is exactly what this is. So people will go back and forth. What is, and I don't like the word consensus because it proves all disagree. I would say there's a large portion of scholars, both Christians and non-Christians, who have come to the place of saying the best explanation for what the Gospels are, what they look like, are historical biographies. They look biographical. Now, what we see today as biographies is a little bit different. And we might maybe give them limited questions, but historical biographies like Plutarch or others that wrote biographies about famous figures would never have written the first person. Mm-hmm. Even if Plutarch knew Julius Caesar or Mark Antony, he wasn't going to write their biography in his own eyes. It was about Mark Antony or whatever. So a biography was always written in more of a third person kind of approach. And they really do look like Greek and Roman biographical books. And so in that way, it would have been odd to say first person, even if they were there. John is another question though, because we're not even sure that John wrote John. Mm-hmm. It's very possible, and even I might say plausible, that John had his own church community that he pastored and led for many years, and that you could kind of imagine like let's just imagine that Robert is the Apostle John, and Robert forms a church community.
The one that Jesus loved, makes sense.
And he's got 10 or 15 really like pastoral disciples that he's raised up over the years. He's constantly talking and teaching them, and we're learning from him. And then maybe as he's older, or even when he passes away, we're like, man, we need to write down everything he said. So John's gospel looks like the Apostle John. It looks like his letters that we do think he wrote, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John. But it's possible that his church community wrote it. And the phrase, the apostle who Jesus loved, was if John wrote it, it has a little bit of a like, all right, dude, whatever. If John's followers who knew him and walked him were commissioned by him, then it would almost be an honorific. This like person, John, that trained us, that taught us everything.
He was faster than Peter. You know?
So that's why that's a very plausible reason why John may not be in the first person, even though all the information would have come directly from the Apostle John.
We hear a lot about like oral tradition being passed down, like instead of being written down, being passed through oral tradition. Was that still happening during this time? Like, would it be like, because if you're saying an oral tradition, you wouldn't say, and then I did this. You'd always refer to the person who did it, because you're probably 3 or 4 generations removed at a certain point. Like, is there some element of influence from oral tradition at that point, or was that already?
Potentially. So, well, there's 2 parts to that question. If you're 3 generations removed, of course you're not going to use I. If you're using I, you're lying.
Yes.
It's important to note that most of the New Testament, the letters, are older than the Gospels. Revelation is probably later, but Paul's letters were probably all written before Matthew was written. We think Paul's letters were done by the 50s. Matthew's probably late 70s, 80s.
Because we can see that Peter was talking about Paul's letters when he's like, hey, I know Paul's really hard to understand sometimes in his letters.
Yeah.
So we know that all those existed already.
Yeah. And so letters are a different thing, though. And that's why the New Testament is broken up into these 2 kinds of different things. Gospels were historical biographies. The epistles, letters, were just letters that leaders wrote to churches. You couldn't be everywhere at one time. You're traveling all the time. These apostles were writing letters to churches to teach, to instruct, to train in the early years of the church. Those were not oral traditions. Those were copied letters, right? So when Paul wrote a letter to the church in Ephesus, it was copied and passed around. The teachings of Jesus, we believe, were written down at some point by somebody. And actually, that's what Papias tells us later. Papias actually said that Matthew wrote down the teachings of Jesus. And it was later assumed that that meant he was referring to the Gospel of Matthew. But it's very possible that Matthew just had a bunch of papyri written down of things Jesus said. And when Luke, I'm speculating here, but when Luke comes around and, he's maybe a little bit later in life, and here's a likely scenario. Someone named Theophilus was probably a Greek Christian who was probably a rich, well-to-do person who said, hey, this stuff needs to get written down. Luke, I know you traveled with Paul. You knew these guys. I want to pay you. I want to upfront the money because it was expensive. And I want you to just get every resource, talk to everybody, and just write a good, solid account of everything that happened. So Luke does that. He sits down and he says, okay, here's exactly what happened. I talked to all these people. I looked at this, the gospel that this guy Mark wrote. I have all these letters and things that this guy Matthew wrote down. I have all my experiences with Peter and Paul, and he writes the gospel. But this is later. So he might have used whatever Matthew wrote, and then whoever actually put Matthew together, or it might have been Matthew, used each other. And so, yeah, they're all they're pulling from each other, but Luke is then going and talking to all the people who are now in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. Like, hey, when you walked with Jesus, I heard he said this. And so oral tradition comes down, and then Luke and Mark and Matthew are putting it down into paper, and then later John would as well. But so those books are definitely oral tradition comes down, is passed over the years, but the epistles are more direct letters that were copied. Did I answer your question, or did I just ramble?
Yeah,
no, that absolutely answers the question.
Yeah. Anything to add in there?
Well, there's a second part to that question that I think is pertinent in that, but that's pretty thorough.
So the second part, it's a different question, but why are there so many story discrepancies between the Gospels? Yeah. What would you say, Robert?
I would say that discrepancies, I think, are probably the wrong word. I think that there are some differences, but differences are not necessarily contradictions. I think that can be a mistake in that. I think there's a few reasons for it, and I have notes, but
Should bring them.
no,
Yeah,
but
bring it
I
in.
have notes. But for one, I think they were all written from their gospel accounts that are written from different perspectives for different purposes. I think we saw a great example of this in The Office just the other day, actually, Pete. As I was talking about, Pete looks at me and he goes, "Hey, you got some new shoes." And I start going off about this whole story about the whole experience that I had that led me to these new shoes that I got on clearance and blah, 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 all these different things. And he starts making fun of me because of how complicated the story about how I got new shoes was. And for Pete, he was like, mine would have been much more abbreviated. And I think we see that in the gospel accounts too. You know, some of the things that people would say, these are discrepancies. Some of them say like, you know, there's places in Mark where they mention one person where the other gospels might mention two. Like for instance, in Matthew 8, there's 2 demon possessed men, where in Mark it's in Mark 5, it's only one. And in Matthew 20, there's 2 blind men, and in Mark 10, there's only one. And so there's certain examples like that. Mark is an abbreviated gospel, uses that word immediately over and over and over again. And he doesn't say that there's only one. He just simply focuses on one because he's abbreviating those types of things as well. So I could go through a lot of different reasons, but the truth is that all of the so-called discrepancies, they all have great explanations that I think continue to keep the integrity and validity of the gospel accounts intact as well. Anything that you guys want to add on that as well? I'm only sharing a little bit of it, but
Yeah, no, that's what I think. It's a fun conversation,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I think my brain wants to like process this a bit more probably. So sometimes my kids ask me questions about the world that my 44-year-old brain has spent a lot of time thinking about, wrestling through, seeing other angles and coming to places that I'm comfortable with or whatever. And then my 7-year-old asked me a question and I'm like, I don't want to just give you this like quick try answer that you're going to hold and 20 years later be like, you didn't, what, you know,
That's true.
Like
Yeah.
there's so much behind the scenes. And I also don't want sometimes to say things to my children that might spin them out because they're not quite ready to hear or
Right.
deal with it. So here's one thing I would say. And this is kind of up for debate. I actually don't think all the discrepancies in the Gospels are explainable.
Oh,
I don't.
Do you
In
have
the
an
sense
example?
in the sense, I think that John disagrees with the synoptic Gospels about the day Jesus died. I think they literally disagree. I don't think you can explain it. People have tried to explain it away. I don't think you can.
gotcha.
The Gospels would seem to suggest that Jesus died the day before Passover and ate the Passover with his disciples. John wants to tell us that Jesus was the Passover lamb and he was crucified on Passover. So the meal they ate the night before wasn't the Passover meal, it was something else. People have tried very hard to reconcile that. And I've read scholars who've tried to like, you just really can't do it. You come to this place of saying, I think one of either John or the other 3, something's happening here.
Right.
Now, what I'm comfortable saying, and this is, you know, we're on a podcast here, this is going on the internet. I'll try to say this well.
Okay.
One thing I would say is this, you hinted at it. All 4 of the gospel authors had an agenda.
Yeah.
And when I say agenda, that word kind of riles us a little bit because immediately we're like, oh, they're trying to deceive us. No.
Purpose for writing might be a
Like, yeah. So I want to tell the story of Jesus, but there's something specific I'm wanting to tell you.
Yes.
And I would, in a very quick overview, and I'm actually, here's a plug. I'm going to be soon releasing a whole like 20-part short video series walking through the background of each of the New Testament books. And I do this about the 4 Gospels.
Right.
One thing that we can see is Mark was writing likely to a very specific group of people who were probably Gentile Christians living under persecution in Rome. Whereas Matthew was probably writing more to Jewish Christians or Jewish people who were struggling with whether or not Like, did we make a mistake here? The temple's been destroyed. Everything's fallen apart. All of my Jewish family members hate me. Like, was Jesus the Messiah? And so when you read Mark's gospel, there's this focus, there's this intention on he fulfilled prophecy. Again, he is the Messiah. When you read Mark's gospel, it's the same story, but it's like there's all these different things, different perspectives, different ways of saying it. It's probably because Mark was writing to Christians who were under heavy persecution and didn't care about fulfilling prophecy. Like, that wasn't their world. They just wanted to know, is this worth dying for? Right. And his thing was like, actually, Jesus died. Jesus was the suffering servant. So much of Mark's focus is on the suffering of Jesus and not on fulfilling prophecy and different things like that. John is probably happening later. John's probably 20, 30 years later. Different ideas, Gnosticism, other things we would later call heresy are now starting to meld into the church. And so much of John seems to want to be battling for the truth. What is the truth of ideas?
Most theological book, yeah.
So there's these different perspectives. And here's the thing about John. And John is a fun book. It looks on the surface like John doesn't care about what we would call chronology, time order.
Right.
It looks like John is comfortable just taking all the different stories and putting them in the way that he wants to put them in it in order to tell something. So John looks like the whole first section of John happens over 6 days. And then on the seventh day, there's a wedding feast. And then you have events that happen over 6 festivals. And then you have the final Passover. And Jesus is the Passover lamb. So there are many scholars who believe that John probably knew, and again, I use the word probably, we don't know. It's possible that John knew that Jesus actually died the day before Passover. But because of his theological positioning of wanting to show and demonstrate how Jesus is the one who takes away our sins, it's sort of like this, almost like not changing the facts in the sense of like lying, but trying to communicate this idea of Jesus is the Lamb of God. It's also possible that Jesus did die on Passover, and the Synoptic Gospels had a reason for maybe changing that. We don't know, but they all had their own bent. And so oftentimes when we look at the what I would say, like, not like dumb, small, like spelling differences or things, which can be attributed to the fact that most of this was spoken in Aramaic and they're all interpreting Greek. Yeah. The things that almost seem like bigger, like, wow, that seems significantly different. In Mark, there's a story, and this is, I have my students do it. You remember this? Yes. You're one of my students.
I have been one of my students.
Mark tells us this great story about the disciples going out into the water in a boat and a storm coming up, and Jesus walking on the water and coming out to them. And at the end of it, he gets in the boat and they're just terrified and they're like, it's a ghost. And they're like, calm down, calm down. You're like, okay, cool. But then you read Matthew, who probably had Mark's gospel when he wrote his own gospel. Matthew's like, yep, they're out in the sea, wind comes, and Jesus walks on the water. They're all scared. Peter says, Jesus, if it's you, let me. Peter walks on the water. And Matthew doesn't say anything about that. Like, what? Why not? And then they get in the boat and it says the disciples worshiped him.
Right.
Which is a very different response, right? And so which one was it? Well, in my opinion, and I'm just giving an opinion, I think it's very possible that Mark probably was the more accurate depiction of that. They probably were freaked out, but Matthew is writing this book in 40 or 50 years after Jesus to these people who were wrestling with, is this actually the Messiah? Is this the person we should be following? And Matthew's like, look, the disciples, it took them a while, but they got it. They saw he was. They were, like Peter got out of the boat and they worshiped Jesus. Like, so there's this focus in Matthew to like really get across this point that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the one you should be worshiping because, and here's, I'm rambling, but by the time that Matthew was written, okay, so I'm a Jewish person, raised in a Jewish home. My grandparents, my great-grandparents, for a millennia, I've been part of a Jewish tradition who believed there was one God and you will worship no other God but Yahweh. That was the most important command. And I have been converted. I've been convinced that I want this Christian thing is real. And you're telling me Jesus is God and I'm supposed to worship him? And I go home for dinner and they're like, you heretic, you're worshiping another God. Get out of our house. Literally. I would get kicked out of my house. My family would disown me. Should I be worshiping this Jesus? And Matthew's like, yes, you should. And so there's this intentional focus of trying to get us to see that side of the story. And so it's like, does that mean one is lying and one is telling the truth? I think that's the wrong way to look at it. It's about what are they focusing? What are they emphasizing? What part of the story are they trying to bring to the surface? And so if you approach it as a 21st century scientifically minded thinker who says, if there's a discrepancy, you're lying, that's not how they wrote in the ancient world. That's not how they thought about it. They didn't consider it lying or telling the truth to like bring certain things out of the stories or focus on certain things. And so I would say that's like even reordering the time order wasn't lying.
Right.
I use an example in my class where I talk about if you wanted to tell a history of Abraham Lincoln, like his biography, you would probably start when he was born and you'd go all the way up point by point until he dies. Good. What if you wanted to write a book about leadership?
There's a book about that. Lincoln on leadership.
Well, but you wanted to use Abraham Lincoln as an example of leadership.
Yeah.
You might say, I'm going to write a book about leadership and I'm going to have 5 chapters. And one of the chapters is telling the truth. Here's 3 different times that Abraham Lincoln told the truth. Another example is about bravery. Right. Here's times in Abraham Lincoln's life when he had to be brave and fight.
Yeah.
It wouldn't like you would take all these different things from Abraham Lincoln's life and move them all around in order to, well, that's how the Gospels approached it. Mm-hmm. Luke seems to be the one that said, no, I'm going to start from the beginning and go to the end. But the other 3 seem more like John's like, I want to talk about the truth of Jesus the Messiah. So I'm going to talk about this and this, and I'm going to move this around. Yeah. And like he wasn't as interested. And so if you know that about John, and then you read it and compare it to Luke, and you're like, whoa, what's going on here? You're like, well, because one is more preaching a sermon and the other is trying to give more of a historical document.
Yeah, that was great.
No, that's good.
Ben
Thank you so
is
much.
looking at me like I need to.
No, not at all. He's just in his own world.
So I have a question, and it kind of coincides with someone else's question. But if we were to just sit and read the Bible we have without any outside help, resources, it seems as if there's a big chunk of information that we're missing as far as context and how to read it. Right. Like if someone, all they had in the Bible and they were to read through it, like they wouldn't know about the way that typical Jewish people wrote biographies or stories. They wouldn't know about the culture surrounding and Luke being hired by, well, they might know that because it says it. But like, what does a person who is not a fully paid pastor need to do to learn more about the context of the Bible that they are basing their life off of? Like, is there resources that they can go to? You know what I mean? Like, so instead of constantly worrying that, I'm sure I'd have the wrong answer here and I can never really be confident because I'm not a full-time student of this. Like, are there resources people can go to, which kind of goes into another question of, do you have a book you'd recommend to understand the Council of Nicaea and the compilation of the Bible? But more of the idea of like, what resources are there out there that we or that people who are listening who are not full-time pastors on staff who get to know this that you would recommend?
Well, I'll take this in a very different direction than I think you're intending me to, but that's okay. I love the Bible. It is my source of truth in my life. Mm-hmm. But a couple things. Number one, the idea that I can pick up a Bible and read it for myself is, very small on the timeline of human history.
Within the last 500 years.
I would say the last probably 200 years even. We had the printing press come up in the 1500s, but that didn't mean everyone had books, much less could even read. The idea that all kids go to school and learn to read is very new for human history. So you had, 1700 years of human history where Christians didn't just sit and read the Bible for themselves. Right. Now, as I talked about in my church history class last year, that also led to something we now call the Dark Ages.
Right. Yeah. That can be.
But here's the thing. Okay, let's talk about balance. If you go back to when all of this kind of started, we usually pinpoint roughly Martin Luther, the Reformation of the church. And what came out of the Reformation was that many things came out of the Reformation, but one of them was how do I say this in a way that doesn't sound bad? Let's call it an exaltation of the Bible. And there's good and maybe even some problems with that. But it was, for Martin Luther, he was arguing against this church structure that had become corrupt and broken and was doing things that didn't even align with the scriptures. And Martin Luther was like, the Bible is the ultimate authority. Right. You and I, as Protestants, protesters, we're descendants of the protest, hear that statement, and it's like, well, of course, it's like air, of course,
Right.
it's just true.
Yeah.
It wasn't just of course when he was living, and people argued with him. They said, no, no, it's not just the Bible. It's also the authority of the church and the apostolic tradition that's been passed down through it for 1,500 years. There's, and you can go back and read, we always, because we're on this side of it, like that's our team, just like the American Revolution, everything was good about it because we're Americans. Like there were well-intentioned Catholic Church leaders who made really good points against Luther. Said, if you throw out the authority of the church, the community of people within which we're supposed to read these scriptures and teach them, you're just going to create a free-for-all. Guess what happened? Within Martin Luther's life, like 150,000 people were killed in religious wars over what the Bible meant.
Yeah.
And within 200 years, you had not one church, but millions.
Yeah, splinters everywhere.
And you had sects and groups and
Denominations.
cults and heresies.
Yeah.
Like, so the benefit of the Reformation was that there were serious problems with the church at the time, like real heresies and untruths, and sin had woven its way into the church leadership, and it needed to be fixed. But one of the problems is this American spirit, which started there, of independence, and it's just me, I'm by myself, I don't need anybody else. Christianity is me and Jesus, I don't need the church. Like, it was an anti-authoritarian movement because the authority of the time was corrupt.
Right.
So when you're under a corrupt authority, everything inside of you says, I need to rebel against that. Well, the problem is we're still living in that.
That's good.
And we reject all authority. We don't want anyone to tell us what to do. Well, here's the deal. Like, and I'm coming from a position of power. I know that, but I'm also telling what I think is the truth in my head. I don't believe that God intended Christians to read the Bible by themselves. Like that isolationist, individualist mentality is not healthy. Like you weren't given the Bible to go off alone by yourself on an island and live Christianity by yourself. Right. Christianity doesn't work by itself.
No.
And you're not meant to grow and learn and read these scriptures by yourself. You're meant to do it in a community. And one of the questions that came in this week was all about why be a part of a church. Well, part of being in a community is you don't have to have a PhD in ancient languages. Like, it's not the way that God intended things to function. He said, I'm going to have a few people go get PhDs in ancient languages. Right. I'm going to have a few people, spend all their time learning this thing and spending all the time learning this. And then we're all going to come together. And we're going to come together. And the things that I don't know about, that I'm not good at, I'm going to let you pour into me. The things that I can do that you can't do. And we're going to be a body that works together. And so when I hear people say like, well, I what can I do to know the Bible better, to learn it better? And I'm like, that's such an awesome question. And there are tons of resources. Just like you've got a pile of them right there. John Walton, read John Walton. But part of it is like, look, like, and I know Brandon was here. He'd probably, I don't know how he'd feel, where he'd go with this, but like I and Robert, and especially Brandon, spend time every single week of our lives thinking through these things in order to get up on a Sunday and help explain them to people so they can understand the Bible.
And
better.
we don't do that alone. We look at a ton of resources.
Sure.
We listen to a bunch of other scholars and
who
people
do
that
it,
have studied for way more years than we have and have more understanding and insight.
And then you take some of it and you create content for us to get into small groups throughout the week and talk about it in a group. And we offer videos and we do a podcast every Monday that we help talk through these things that you can listen to. Like
That's resources.
The church is the resource. The church is the primary resource. You are meant to read the scriptures and study them in a community of people.
It's a great insight.
That is a great answer.
And I would say like individualist Christianity is just a sin. It's brokenness. It's not Christianity.
But it's the air we breathe. Like it's as American as.
I don't need the church. I got my Bible and Jesus and YouTube.
Like it's Like my question was assuming you took my question and then looked at the assumption it was based on was I should be reading my Bible by myself. How do I get more resources? And you're saying you shouldn't be reading the Bible by yourself. You should be reading it in a community.
Yeah. And even like I'm a firm believer in this. And you guys, those of you that know me know this, like the power of the Holy Spirit is amazing. The power of God to speak to us directly. Sometimes I open my Bible and I read things and the Holy Spirit speaks to me. And I know, my brain knows, that's not what that verse is about. And yet God in that moment is communicating something he wants to communicate to me. And so I'm not saying that you shouldn't read the Bible by yourself. I'm not saying that God can't reveal things to you. I think there's a place for that. However, I am somebody that, and I've said this before in this podcast, so much of my life and my big decisions have come from hearing God speak. I have misheard God thousands of times.
Right.
Like I have done and thought things that I thought were God that later I realized weren't.
Yeah.
It is so important that I am grounded in a Christian community, that I have other people around me who also have the Holy Spirit, who are also reading the scriptures, who've also studied it. That I can be like, hey, I'm kind of thinking this. What do you guys think? No, that's crazy. Oh, okay, thank you. When you isolate yourself and try to do it by yourself, I mean, that's what Joseph Smith did, right? He went off by himself. He's like, I need to get my own revelation of what the Bible means. An angel appears to him and says, this is the truth. And you start an entire new religion. Like there's so much danger in leaving community. Yes, the Holy Spirit can speak to you. Yes, it's so important to be reading the Bible on your own and spending time in it and learning it, but doing it in a community where you're accountable to others, where we look back and, hey, over 2,000 years, this is how the church, and when I say the church, like millions and millions of Christians have saw this and read it and applied it to their lives. Are you aligned with that? And that was my fourth point yesterday, like the who, the what, the when, but also the where.
Yeah.
Is it universal? Is everybody reading this? Does everybody think that Jesus is actually this, like a literal begotten son who is the brother of Satan and you're going to get a planet one day when you die? Do all Christians read the Bible that way? No, maybe there's something wrong.
Yeah.
So being in community is so important.
Wow.
Yeah. Great insight.
That was great. Thank you for answering that.
You're welcome, John. I get paid to answer it though. So I don't know. Should you receive thanks when you get paid to do something? I had that question this morning. This is a completely unrelated question. Are you a hero if you're doing your job?
You can have a heroic job. You can have a heroic job.
I mean,
well, I was thinking about it, I was like, it was a dumb question, but we were driving and we saw some firemen and I was like, those are heroes, guys. Those are real heroes. And I was like, they also get paid. And they're like, no, they're heroic.
Yeah, right.
Even if you get paid, you're going to a burning building. You're a freaking hero.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like the days now where it's like you go to McDonald's or whatever, and this is a bad example for McDonald's, but you go there and then you have a machine
to leave a tip.
Right? Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Like,
no.
Oh man! Now value bases are coming out
to everyone's ears that were just brutally murdered
for ringing up my McDonald's order.
Yeah.
Oh
exactly.
Man. I'm not gonna lie. There's a guilt factor that always makes me go,
nope.
All right, here's 15.
I know. I have no tip.
If I feel bad,
I turn it around and show them I'm pushing no tip.
Right. I'll try to hit the no receipt, so that they can't see that I didn't tip
the people at the donut place who I love, and they have amazing donuts, and the guy rings me up for $1 a donut. I give my kid you want to leave a tip? I'm like, for what? For what? You get paid to do this? Why would I leave you a tip?
Oh man, that's a whole different conversation.
Yes.
But
off the rails.
Yeah. So, anyway, well, thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode.
Yeah,
we've Robert speaking this week,
and if you want to leave a tip for your rice,
please don't. Just
my Venmo is I'll make sure they get it.
The tips will be like, you needed to do this better. And do that. I got some tips for you.
We already get tips every week. We don't want any more of those tips.
Well, like I said, Robert's speaking next week. We're really excited for that message. What are you talking on?
Talking about, is Jesus really the only way to God?
Ooh, yes.
Kind of going through that tripping hazard.
No
big deal.
Yeah. So we hope you guys join us for that, and we hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and we'll see you next time.
See you guys.